Hello, everybody. Welcome to Northwest Arkansas Coders guest speaker segment. I'm super excited to have a what I consider a friend on with me today, and somebody who has been awesome with me in the past. And so, like pretty much every single guest I have in here, I don't know what number we're on now. I've lost count. I've had a lot of cool people on here, and I'm excited tonight to bring another cool person. I'll get into that in just a moment. Northwest Arkansas Coders is a group of developers based out of Northwest Arkansas, but not limited to. We have members spanning, kind of all over, and our main goal is to just kind of provide a safe space, a community of developers who are just kind of there to help out. We have community projects going on. If you're interested, just DM me in any way, and I will kind of break into this segment now. So, as I was saying, this is the guest speaker segment. I have Coriano Harris on with me today. Coriano's a React developer, and he's really cool guy. So I'm super excited. I'll kind of give it over to him to slightly introduce himself, and I know he is eager to get into the React.
Hey guys, once again, my name is Coriano Harris. I'm excited to be here, excited to talk about React. As Zach mentioned before, I am a React developer and I'm currently lending those skills to an organization called Alley Financial. So I'm enjoying that experience too, allowing me to go way deeper into React than what I was accustomed to. So that's been awesome to just continue to learn about this really cool library. But I am a man of small words, and I just love to get right into the React, and hopefully at the
Perfect.
end be able to answer any questions that you guys have. So yeah, without
Yeah.
further ado, I'll kind of get started.
Yeah, let me add your screen to the stream, and I'll kind of keep up with chat or anything else.
Awesome, perfect. Okay, so this talk, like I said, it's a conversation about React. There won't be any live coding in this one, but I thought it would be really good just to kind of break down React, kind of break down the different features, just break down the different process, and yeah, just kind of learn together and grow. And hopefully, if you're interested in React, diving in there, if you're currently using, maybe there'll be some new things that you can add to your tool set. So yeah, let's get started. So for here, because of kind of how my process and brain works, just a little breakdown of what we're going to be discovering, just some facts, benefits, kind of how to install React. We'll look a little bit at the file structure. One of the main files, which is index.js, was index.js, which is important. Components, lifecycle, methods and hooks, kind of the JX, the DOM, some styling, routing, and then testing. And then I've got a bonus if that time persists on some interesting thing that you can do resolve in case you get some errors with React. So the first one we're going to talk about is just some facts. React was released in 2013. It was created by a gentleman named Jordan Walk. It still is maintained by Facebook, and it is considered an open source library. Now, there might be some debates on that, which I am open to that when we do the Q&A, but Facebook and me have decided that this is a library. That's what I call it. And then lastly, React is a single page application. And so what that basically means is that there is one main container or div, and then all of the components kind of live within that. What's really awesome about a single page application is that it allows to give that experience of a multi-page application, but what it's really doing is just popping and pushing off different components depending on what's being um, selected or what route's been directed for a particular component. So just some benefits. React is really great with reusable components. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation, as well as we'll talk a little bit more about the virtual DOM. So DOM stands for Document Object Model. And once again, like I said, I'll be going through that a little bit more in detail through the slide. And lastly, it's just a support system That's very big for me. And React has a huge, thriving community for support, whether that's online or whether that's through various communities. And so now we'll start with kind of React, kind of like the process for installing that. So there's really two ways that you can install React. One is going through, which was kind of more the traditional way, which was the content delivery network. And what that basically is just networks of servers that allow you to kind of distribute content between websites. It does add some additional features like security. It tends to be a faster have a faster performance. And so that's initially how React was. And if you can kind of see here, hopefully you're able to see the image on there. You'll see that there's the script. And so React has a development script as well as a production script. And then if you look to the right, you'll see create React app, which I think is one thing that's really awesome about React, because they tend to really try to figure out ways to make the experience better for developers. And so they decided to come out and create React, which is kind of more of a boilerplate. And what's nice about that is it comes with already pre-installed dependencies. Whereas if you use the traditional way, you would have to manually be inputting these dependency in. So if you look here, it's just an example of how you can create a React app. In this case, we're using npm. We have the install. We've got the -z, which stands for global, and then create React app. And then right after that is where you're going to put the name of the app that you're getting ready to create. Once that has been built, then what you can do is then cd into, which is basically change your directory into that particular React, create React application folder, and then open up your IDE, and in there through the terminal and put in this command of yarn start, which will actually run your application in a browser on port 3000, which is really going to be localhost 3000 for you. So it'll be a local environment for you. And then, so now I'm going to kind of go through the file structure when you see what the create React app. And I thought it would be important to kind of break down some of these files for you. So when you see that, you'll see a build file. Depending on what environment you want to build that in, majority of the time that build will be for production. You've got your node modules. You have your public folder, and the most important file in that public folder is your index.html. And that's because the browser is actually looking for that file. And then, but most of your work when it comes to React, it's going to be in that source folder. And so in there, you'll have your assets, which tends to be like your images, your logos. And then you'll have your components. You'll also have like your helpers, your util, your styles. And then it'll also include this index.js file, which is a very important file in React. And I have another slide that kind of breaks that down. And then you'll see that you have your Git, and you have your package.json and a README file. So that create React app is just really awesome for us not having to implement all of those dependencies on our own. They already come kind of pre-installed and allow us to kind of move quickly to start working on the most important part of that is creating components and building your application. And so now I'm going to talk about the index.js file. So the importance of the index.js file, because this is a file that React is looking for importing your component, or another way, a module, onto your parent component or folder in a sense. And it follows after the documentation of Node. So Node has this folder as a module process. And basically what this is doing is saying, hey, I want you to grab this particular component, and I want you to append that to the div that has the ID of root, which is going to be the main container for your whole application. Now, because I'm a nerd, because I like to go under the hood, this is how that's communicating. The index.js file is communicating with the index.html file is actually through Webpack. And Webpack is a really awesome bundler. And they've got various plugins. And this particular plugin allows the index.js file to be injected into the HTML file. So when you look at the HTML file, you'll see that there's a div that has an ID of root, and then you'll also see a script that will have be sourcing this index.js file. And if you look to the right, this is kind of how a component is being appended to that main div of that React application, or what we call an SPA. And so here we've got a React DOM, which is the dependency that you do import. And within, they've got a render method. And in that render method is where you're going to pass in that particular component. And then you have that document.id, which is then going to append that a component to whatever div has that various ID. And so that's why the index.js is important. Now, you don't necessarily have to go directly. You can have it through the component.js file, but majority of the time, you're going to have that through the index.js file, especially because React is initially looking for that in that file. And then from there, we'll go like the components, kind of the more fun part of that. And just a quick thing, components are really just functions. The only difference, they are required is to return some type of HTML file. And so, yeah, so for me in the beginning, it was a little scary about that, but then I realized like, okay, these are really just functions, and the whole purpose of that function is to return some type of HTML. And so in React, there's three types of components. One is a class component, second one is a functional component, and the third one is a pure component. So the pure component is just basically, it's a class that has a special feature to it that the regular class does not have. So first of all, are you guys able to see the as far as the images on the slide? How's that looking for you
Yeah,
guys?
yeah,
Okay.
they're coming through right now. You're on a components slide with class
Correct.
function
Okay, perfect.
pure. Okay,
So
perfect.
I'm kind of breaking down these the each of these components, kind of what React has. So for a class component, um, the biggest benefit of that is that the class component is the only component that can have its own state. So the class component is the only one that's going to have a state object. And so that's a good way to know when you might want to use a class component compared to a functional component, is depending on your state. Like, does it have to have its own state for this particular component? If it does, then you have to use a class for this. And just kind of breaking down this class here from the example. So we've got the React.component, which is the parent, and it's extending into this class called clock. Basically, clock is now a child of the component of the React.component. And inside there, there's a constructor. And this is where the really, to me, a lot of the magic happens, because a constructor is where it's able to create instances or copies of the class. And in there we have also a super method, which allows that instance to have access to the parent's properties. And then also where the state is also housed. And if you look here, we've got a this object that then has a state object. And inside there in the state, we have an object that has a property called date, which is going to just be assigned whatever the current date at that particular time. Then you'll see a couple other methods underneath, which are called lifecycle methods. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in detail. And then there is another function that's below that, which is called tick. And that function in this particular line of code is not needing to be passed to the state, meaning that they don't need that a new instance of that clock class does not need to have that particular function applied or in the state. But in case you wanted that, if you wanted the tick method to also be a part of the new instance, then you would need to do what we call using the bind method to be able to bind that to the state. And so how that would work would be, it would be this dot tick, and that would just equal this dot tick dot bind this. And what that will do is bind that function to the state object. That way, a new instance also gets access to it as well. And then below there, you'll see that there's a render method that then has a return method inside of it. And so the render is actually a lifecycle method as well. And it's most important from what I was saying that a component has to render some type of HTML. And so because that's the really the only life cycle method that's required for that, that's the most important that you have to make sure that you have. And so that's kind of a class component. And really the big difference is, do you need to have your own state? If you need to have your own state, then you have to use a class. Now for a functional component, what's nice about it, it tends to be less code that you have to write compared to a class. But functional components initially were stateless. And that's because they don't create instances. And therefore, they're not able to have a state object. But once again, React was like, let's try to figure out a way to make this experience better for our developers. And so that's when they introduced hooks, which allows the functional components to be able to get access to the state and other lifecycle methods that the class gets access to. And so in this particular example here, we are we are getting access to two of the hooks from the React, which is use state and use effect. We are writing a function, so we don't have to start by putting a class. We just have a function. And inside there, we've got a use state hook. And this particular use state hook has two values in it. So in a sense, it can be a tuple, and it's an array with a initial value, and then it has a method that will update that value. And then also there's a use effect hook too, and this is more for side effects. Basically, anything that you don't necessarily have control of is where use effect would be really beneficial. And one example would be APIs, because we don't necessarily have control of when that API is going to return the information that we need. And so that's just a quick overview. I'm going to go into hooks and life cycles a little bit more, but just kind of quickly breaking down the functional. And then the last part is that you don't need a render method in a functional. You just have a return method. And as you can see here. And then the pure component, which I kind of mentioned before, is also a class component, but it has this unique feature where if the values don't change, then the component doesn't get re-rendered. And what's great about that is for performance. But traditionally, React components, anytime there's an update, doesn't matter if the value is still the same, it's going to re-render. But pure components allows you to not have that experience, and that is by calling this lifecycle called should component update, which is really a boolean that's going, what's the previous value or state? Let's compare it to the current one. Have they changed? No. Then that's going to be false, and that component is not going to re-render. The A lot of people say use this sparingly. I've only used this a couple times. One thing that's kind of challenging is performance a little bit, because it does that check before deciding what to do. So if you did change something in a pure component, it's doing that check, and then after that, it's rendering whatever it needs to render. So it's not necessarily like that it's a lot of milliseconds, but depending on what you have, it could kind of hinder some performance too as well. So definitely recommend to use those sparingly. But the way things are going now, functional components are kind of the direction that everyone's kind of leaning more towards. And then a little bit more about components. So there's presentational or dummy components, and then their container. The difference between those is that components are just looking for presentational components are just looking for how things look. They rarely have any state. They do use this props.children, and basically what that is uh, if it's like a div, and inside the div you have other HTML elements where you have like an H1 tag, maybe a P tag. that's where the that will be placed. So if you have, it allows you to not have to directly add those in. The props children actually inject those into that space for you. And so that's one thing that presentational will use, is to pass those as far as passing in children and different other elements. And then lastly, it it can receive data and it does callbacks through props. And prop there's so a component comes with a basically really a props object, and in there you'll have access. And the way that the props work, or I guess a good way to say that would be the properties that you see between inside of the opening tag inside of React, and you'll see that. I'll show you a little bit more of that, but that's considered what props are. And then the other one is a container. So container is considered where your logic is done, where it's focused more on how things work. And some people actually do structure their React application by presentational and by containers. And once again, that's up to you how you want to manage your file structure. But I've been seeing that too as well. And then once again, the container tends to have be stateful, and it really focuses a lot on the data state and behavior, which then is passed to the dummy components. And so now we're going to get into life cycle methods and hooks. Once again, they're really just functions. Life cycle methods is just, they're functions that kind of work on events within a component. So there's three categories of a component. There's mounting, when it's being placed into the DOM. There's updating, and when things need change. And then there's unmounting, like it's no longer needing, so I'm popping it off. As I mentioned before, the most important life cycle method is the render, because that's required for a component. And then here's two other life cycle methods that I see pretty regularly when I'm looking at a class component. And one is the component did mount. And so what this is doing is, once the component has been mounted onto the virtual DOM, then whatever logic inside that is then being executed. These with the component did unmount, that's when the component is no longer in use or getting ready to be destroyed, and whatever logic is between is running for that. And then, so for those two, it's one when it's mounted, the other one when it's getting ready to be unmounted, in a sense being destroyed. Certain logic will be able to be executed for that. And then we move over to hooks. Once again, those are functions, but these are all for functional components. The reason for the name of hooks comes from the concept that we're hooking into React state and life cycle features. As I mentioned before, there's no render method, it's just a return method. And the two most popular um, hooks are the use state and use effect hooks. Um, they, with the use effects and hook, they once again they do pass an initial value, so initial variable, and one example would be count. And then you have a second argument, which would be a function which it's going to run to update that counter. So a good example would be, a counter might have a default initial value of 0, but then you have set counter, and inside that you put count plus 1. So now we know that's going to update that. So that function is going to update the counter from 0 to 1. The use effect is really interesting because it passes in a callback function, or I wouldn't say a call, but yeah, I guess you'd say a callback function, and also an array of dependencies. And the way the use effect hook works is that you pass in a function, and then for the second argument, which is the array, it's looking for what you want it to watch for updates. So it's looking at like the counter, it says it can be where you can have that inside the array. And what it's doing is checking the counter's value to see if that's updated. And if it updates, it's going to execute that um, block of code that's inside the function. One thing to keep in mind is if you do not have, if you don't pass in that second argument or that array, it will re-render every time there is an update. And that's not what people want because use effect is really for side effects. And once again, side effects are things that we can't really control. And so the last thing you want to do is have that to be executing every time the component re-renders. And second of all, if you leave that array, um, if you leave it empty, what it's telling the use effect is to only re-render one time, and that's on the um, initial mount of the component. And so when it comes to like APIs, people use that for that as a process because it allows you to go ahead and mount and render the component and then pass in what data it needs to. And so that's a good use case for use effect. Uh, the next thing is kind of JX and TX. So JX stands is for JavaScript, and TX is for TypeScript. These are actually XML syntax, so they're not HTML at all, but they give you the experience of writing HTML, which is so powerful. So React traditionally, and it actually still does this, so it compiles the JavaScript down to react.createElement function. And that is using Babel for the JSX and TSC for the TXX, which TSC stands for TypeScript compiler. If you look at the images on the right, you'll first see how you create an element in React. As you see here, you've got the first argument is a tag, the second one is actually for props, and then the third one is the children, which is the that could be, for instance, this case would be text, like you could have a title. And as you can see here that we are nesting, this particular one is has a div, and then it's creating an image tag, and it's creating creating an h3 tag. So this is a really tough way of creating HTML. uh, and so that's where JX comes in, and it's so great that they've been able to create this feature or extension because um, if you look at the third image, which is JX, that is so much better for me to read and understand and write. The middle image, just an example to let you know that you can write pure JavaScript in React 2 as well. And so that's another cool thing about React 2 is that you can just write straight JavaScript in there, and you don't have to utilize any of the React features. And then now we're going to like the virtual DOM. And so this is the other really cool feature benefits is this virtual DOM. And it's kind of really a concept that React is kind of, I feel, kind of owns that concept because what it ends up doing is it puts a layer above the DOM object in the browser. And so when you are renting a component, it's going to that virtual DOM. That virtual DOM is doing a diff calculation. So it's checking to say, like, has anything changed on its component, almost like a snapshot. So it's got a previous snapshot, then it's getting that new snapshot and it's comparing it. And it goes, oh, okay, the button's color has changed. And then that is being communicated to the browser versus what typically happens, like when you do like a vanilla application with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it re-renders the whole page. And so that allows for better performance in React when it's just giving the updates to the browser DOM versus giving it the whole component. And I'm not going to go too much deeper into that, but it uses cache with that. But that's one of the really cool features of the virtual DOM is that it's only sending to the browser what actually changed versus saying, hey, something changed, but I'm going to have you re-render the whole component. Um, and so that's a nice thing about here. This concept with style components is something that I've been really exploring lately. Once again, React, you can use CSS, you can use Sass, you can use less in there. But what's really cool about style components is that they automatically do vendor prefixing. And so what that means is that it automatically adds those prefixes, whether it's for Safari, Chrome, um, Firefox. And instead of you having to, as a good example would be Gulp. So Gulp has an auto prefixer dependency that you can install in that and have that run to do that. This allows you to not have to do that. And then it also creates a unique class name, and it also eliminates dead styles. So basically styles that are no longer being used are removed from there, which then will help as far as your CSS, making your CSS smaller, and then allow for the browser to be able to cache the CSS a lot quicker. And then second, it scopes to your component. And what's nice about that too is that it eliminates the CSS collisions. So you know that this particular style is going to be scoped to this element, but I can also use that style on multiple ones. So a good example would be a header. I can have a particular style for a header for a form component, and then I can use that same one for a paragraph component as an example. And because these are React components, you can actually pass props in there. So the props object can be used in style component as well. And if you look to the images on the right, is just an example of creating a style component. So in this one, we're importing style from style component, and then we're creating a style button, and then we're passing in some CSS rules. And then at the end, we're making a component that's returning that button. And what's nice about that is now when that button, when you look at that button in the HTML, it'll be similar to the second image where you're looking here, where you see those classes all have unique identifiers. So it eliminates that CSS collision part of that. And so that's really, really nice to know that your styles won't affect other components. Like it'll always just be scoped to that particular component. And that's a nice feature to have with that. And now we're getting to routing. So with routing, you have to import React Router. React Router comes with 3 routers. Uh, People mostly use the browser router. That is, the routers are used to sync URL. So I'll make sure that to let people know that. So those routers are used to be able to sync your URLs. The browser router uses the HTML5 history API. And what that allows is for you to be able to basically go backwards and forwards. And so I can go a little bit more in that, but there is an API and it has an object and it has a stack. And that's kind of how it makes the decision on whether to go back to a previous URL or forward to the current URL. The second one is a hash router. The all 3 of the routers do the same thing except for one thing differently. The hash router will allow you to hide part of your URL. I haven't had a situation where I had to do that, but if that's the case where you don't want the full URL to be displayed to the user, you can use that, which will then hide a portion of that. And the second one is just if you want your URLs to stay in memory. Um, I haven't found a use case for memory router. I mean, I'd like to try hash router at some point, but primarily when it comes to router, I'm using the browser router. And then if you look to the left, it's just kind of example of kind of how um, that is implemented in React. Don't really focus on the React DOM render. It's just kind of the image I was able to find to use. But in this example here, we've got router that is wrapping around a div and some routes. So the router one is actually an alias. So the import was actually import browser router as router from React Router. But in this case, they're using browser router. They're just using an alias for the identifier for that component. And then we have the routes. And so the routes is where the matching, the URL will match with the component. That's where components are rendered. The route comes with a keyword of exact, which will basically look for that exact match. If you don't have those keywords, the keyword of exact in there, what it's doing is it's matching the first character with the different routes. So if I took out the exact from both of those routes, then it would render both of those pages because they both start with a backslash. Um, a way to get around that was another component called switch, and what switch does, it will only return one match of the URL. And if you look at that, it allows you to eliminate the exact keyword, so we no longer need that. And then it does change the render, change render. It does change the render to component. And so those are the two different. But what's really nice about this is that it's just going to return one match of it. And so it just saves you having to write the exact and stuff in there if you want to. And now links. There's two links. There's a nav link and there's a link. They do the exact same thing, except once again, one significant feature that separates them. So when I first started React, I was under the impression that you can only use that for navigation, and that is not the case. The difference between this is that the nav link allows you to um, assign styles to the link directly, and the link tile does not allow you. Those are the only two differences. Other than that, they do exactly the same thing. So that's something I look at too, going, do I need to style this link? And if I do, then I'm going to choose to go with nav link. If I don't, then I'll just do link. Here's an example where you can see that they have a class applied of active to it. This would not work if it was applied to the link tag, or sorry, to the link component. And then lastly is testing. React tends to use Jest for their unit testing. They also have React test library. So just to quickly go through this, particular one we got to describe, which is doing a test suite, and then we're actually executing the test with the it method, and it's getting assertions and where it's expecting 2 plus 2 to be 4. If you look to the React test library, this is testing components. And what's interesting is that this is actually a default test that's in the React when you use create React app. And so in this case, we are getting the render function out of the test React test library. We're importing the app component because that's what we want to test. And then once again, we're getting the test suite. And then they use the word test instead of it to execute the test. And then we're using the render method to render the component. So what this is doing is testing to see if the app component will render when the application is running. And then lastly, but not least, are just some bonus stuff here. So on the left side, you'll see, the reason I brought these up because you'll see errors if these are not included. And so for labels, we're used to, HTML, we're used to using the for to assign a label to a particular input field. But in React, you have to do HTML4. If not, you're going to get an error thrown. It doesn't necessarily mean that your application is going to break, but you're going to be having a bunch of error. Every time you run it, it's going to be asking you to update that. So for labels, you want to use HTML4 to have those connected with a particular input field. For loops, React requires a key. And for the reason for that is because React wants to track changes. And so the key is the way that it's able to track changes that happen to a value. And so you will get an error message if you don't have an index in there, or really just a key. If you don't have a key, you will get an error message. And that's one of these are one examples of how to get around that by just assigning the index so that when it loops through there, it's either going to be zero and then whatever amount that's in that array, that each one will have that unique index. And the thing too is it has to be a unique um, key. So the value does have to be unique. It's not going to allow you to have the same use the same value for different keys. And then if you look here, it's for accessibility. That's something that my company at Ally really focused on, and something I focus on myself. And it's just letting you know that there's an option out there for you, and kind of how to install the accessibility, React's accessibility into your applications. And then there's another interesting hook, which is called use context. And use context is used really to share specific data between components. Basically, it's like global data or state. And what's nice about that is it eliminates having to do prop drilling. So in React, you go down, in React, you don't go a bubble up. So it eliminates having to do prop this and then go to a nested component and then do props that. And so it's really nice. And I'm seeing this used a lot more often, especially for when it comes to providing a theme, a light or a dark theme that you know is going to be passed into various components. And then lastly is conditional rendering. So conditional rendering is really interesting because you're now able to conditionally render a your JX or your element. So this is example here. We've got a functional component. It is it's got props, and then it's assigning a prop. Well, it's assigning a car to props.car to cars, and then what it's doing here is checking in the return. It's got a H1 tag of it's got a sorry I'm going through all that, but so you got an H1 tag that has garage, and then it is doing a conditional rendering on the amount of cards. So if none exist, then the H2 will not display. If there is a card that exists, then it's going to display that H2, and then if you can look in there, it's going to pass in a sense, the value of one to that page. So yeah, so I know I kind of probably went fast. There probably a lot of questions, so I'm looking forward to answering those. But that's kind of just a quick overview of just kind of the experience in React and the different features and the things that you can do with that. So my last slide is just really a way to get in contact with me. If you want to say hi, I have a website, CorianoHarris.com. Also part of a really awesome tech community called CodeConnector.io as well. And so that's another great resource. And I'm just happy to help out any way I can.
Perfect, man. I really just want to thank you for that. I've wondered some of this stuff, like the difference between use state and use effect and stuff. You hear about those calls all the time. That was interesting. I was gonna ask you a little bit more uh,
Mm-hmm.
about the difference between the virtual DOM and the real DOM.
Okay. Um, so do you kind of you know how the DOM works, where you have the window object, and then you have the DOM object is where the elements will be displayed. And so
Yeah,
what React does is it puts a layer above. So it's basically when the component gets rendered, it goes to the next step would be the virtual DOM. So it's like this layer above it. And that virtual DOM has a snapshot of that component. And so what it's doing is it's doing a check of going, okay, this is the previous component. I got a now it re-rendered. So now I got a new snapshot of the component. Did anything change? And it goes, yep, okay, it did change. The button now is green instead of red. Okay, awesome. So then it takes whatever has changed and says, hey, DOM in the browser, I'm going to be sending you this button. I'm only going to be sending you the button, and it's going to be in the color of a red instead of blue. So that's kind of a other than going really deep into it, because what it's doing is it's doing a snapshot. So it's basically taking a cache and it's evaluating that with the update. And then what it's doing is going, okay, within this comparison, only the button changed. So I'm going to just send that. Everything else can still be represented in that cache.
Okay, so it basically is just comparing two objects from one another and seeing if there is any difference. And if there is a difference, it's just going to select what's different and re-render that.
Correct. So
Okay.
yeah, it's very simple to kind of like get diff. When you use that command, that shows you what has changed and what hasn't.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
very similar to that. Yeah.
All right. So Eric asked, he said he's been wondering for a while. Are there? Oh, it moved on me. Okay, sorry. Are things like use context, and redux pretty much the same as global variables? How are they different?
They are similar in a sense of their point of that is to manage state. Um, they it kind of, to me, it depends on what kind of state I'm trying to manage, but context is um, the point of context is to have an easier state managed experience than Redux. And that's kind of what the goal is too. And so, as I was mentioned, I'm seeing a lot of people move from using Redux to use context because it's one, it's easier to understand. It uses less. Um, I want to say, in a sense, like less code, because you have to have a dispatcher, you have a action, you've got to, and the contact kind of use contact kind of has that all built in versus you specifically having to create your actions of saying like when this happens, then I want you to dispatch this. Um, that's kind of my of Redux, but they do manage the global variables. They do allow for that. And so to answer his question, they both do the same thing with that. One has a bunch of stuff already built in, so you don't have to worry about that as much. Where the other one, you kind of have to manually, like said with Redux, you're gonna have to you put in your action types, all that. Where use context, you don't necessarily have to do that to get it to pass that global those global variables or values to other components. And then what you tend to do is you wrap them in a provider, which is really nice. And kind of what I had in my slide where you saw the style button and you saw it had style, like the component, and then it had login, and then it had, so I'll kind of show you here. Let's see here. Let's see here. An example of this, where is, where did I put that? Okay, so it's kind of similar to looking at this router one, where you've got the router and then you've got the children tags underneath. That's what a provider will do. It's like you just pass in router dot. In this example, you can put link dot provider, and then what's happening is that provider is getting access to to those global states, and then through that the children components are now getting access to it.
Perfect. Awesome. Let's see. JC is asking, how can someone new to React slowly build up their React capabilities and experience?
Uh, do a lot of WTFs. Really, just a lot of like diving deeper. I'm a person that I like to know the why behind things. Um, for me, that just helps me to feel more comfortable and allows me to go to the edge and test and try different things. So that's really how I've gotten this. Is I've read the React documentations from I read the whole documentation, so that's that's a good example of what how I like to do things. And then I just kind of play around with it. But that has helped me so much is just reading the documentation, and it's an application that I enjoy working in. So I decided I wanted to really understand it. So I just read documents from page one to the last page, and then started just kind of playing around and applying those. And then I was also fortunate that several of my employers use React, so I got to dive deeper into it.
I'm gonna add on to that too. Is just build and break stuff, right?
Yeah.
JC already knows that, but you know, whatever project you're, whatever thing you're gonna do next, and use React. For me, I read documentation whenever I get to the point of like, how do I do this thing that's similar that I've done before? Like, for instance, like, how do I bind? How do I do two-way binding? How do I do one-way binding? Stuff like that. Like, you just kind of get to the point where you need to use this thing, and you implement it. And so let's see, Austin, my friend Austin here, wants to know if there are any plugins or extensions you use or recommend. And then he's got some other questions after that as well.
Could, as far as plugins extension, could you give me a little bit more context around there? Is it for, are you talking about for React or development in general, Austin?
Let's see. Might take a second to come through, but
Okay.
let's start with
Okay.
React. Is there any React specific stuff?
Okay. Yeah, and we can come back to that, and I can kind of maybe tell you a couple things with the extensions. But let me see here. Okay. So only the functional components and class components pretty much do the same thing, except for one thing is the state. Functional components can't. Functional components don't have a state, so therefore they don't, in a sense, they don't have a constructor, and therefore they can't create instances of it. And so, um, because they can't create instances of it, they have to the hooks have to be used. And once again, you have no control over how the hook is executing your values. We don't have control over that. And so the big difference with the class and the functional is, do you want to have control over your state? Do you want to assign a specific state to a component versus saying, no, I don't want to have control of the state. I'm going to just create some state, but I'm going to allow React's hooks to decide how that's going to be processed or executed. So that's really the difference. Is if you want custom state and you want to make sure that's applied to your component, then you want to use a class component. But if you don't necessarily care about having your own state, then you can use a functional. And what kind of another way of looking at it is that um, the state that you use in your functional is not necessarily, in a sense, bound. Well, technically, it becomes bound because of the hook has does that under the hood, but technically, your a functional component doesn't have the state is not bound to that component, and that's where you come into where you have like what's a good example? You have your own components, and then you have like reference components, not components, sorry, reference state, and you got that. where you can reference, be able to have access to the state another way. But an own means that that state is bound to that particular component, and it's not going to, there's not going to be collisions with other instances of it. So that might be a little bit overwhelming, but I'm trying to think of a
So
better way to say
I,
it.
I think the question was more centered around like extensions that you add on to VS Code for development wise, like React extensions that you can
Hmm.
download in the you know
Um,
extensions.
yeah, I just to be honest, I try to use um as little extensions as possible, just for me, because it distracts me to have a bunch. But I pretty much just use the VS Code. There's a VS Code like ES something React snippets, and that's kind of what I use. Other than that, I just write everything out manually. The snippets does allow you to put in certain like snippets where you can do like RFC, which will do a React. It'll basically create out a React component that will have a render method in it already for you, and then all you have to do is just apply what you need to. So that's kind of what I use for a plugin with React. A couple plugins that I use on the browser. So I do use the React plugins on the browser, which is really nice for me to be able to use for in my dev tools. That's kind of what I use a lot of this. So there's React Dev Tools, which there's an extension for that, and then that allows you to be able to look at components and stuff through your dev tool. There also the React one where it actually will let you know if you're currently on a React application or not. That's also something that I kind of look at too as well.
That kind of leads into my question. So, whenever we were talking about minifying stuff, how React minifies stuff, and um you had showed an example with the class names being changed, right, for elements,
Mhm.
and I was wondering if the class names were changed, like how do you debug that? And I think you kind of alluded to that right there was with the React extension with your dev tools, because I'm assuming
Correct.
that there it points you uh, better towards what you're looking for. Uh,
Correct. And you can still now the cool thing too is with the style components, like with your components, you can still pass in a class name if you want to. So
okay,
that
okay,
example they did not, but you still can pass in a class name. Now it's going to generate that, and what it should be doing is having that string where it says sc dash and whatever that hash is, and then your class name. So you can see, yeah, so you can still pass a class name into the style components if you want to. You just don't have to, because it's going to automatically create a new class name for you. So
okay. That makes
yeah, so
sense.
yeah, yeah. So you can do that for testing, which I have done too, where I have had a class name that and then and then it generated a unique one as well. Um, and then you can use that to test, or once again, you can use the dev tool where there's a component part of it where you can look and see what components are available or what components have rendered onto your particular page.
Yeah, okay. So that just gives you a general direction of where where the bug is
Yeah,
coming from
yeah,
to help
yeah.
you get started
Yeah,
on.
it's it's really interesting to figure out because there's got to be use cases more when to use that and when not to. But what's really awesome is just being able to create one header style and apply it to wherever you need to, and know that there's not going to be any collisions or anything with that, which is really nice. And you can also still update that too, which is kind of nice too.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really cool. I I hope to one day be able to dive a little bit more into React. I have to pick that up on my own time, I'm sure. But Charles, which I'm sure you know from Code Connector, he says that he's built things with React before, but it's been a while. Do you have any suggestions for a moderately complex React app that he could build for practice?
Um, I, it's funny because before I was so against it, but like, for me to do apps really helped out. They actually
Yeah,
really
they
did
do.
help out. They
They
really did
really
because they a lot you had to bring in different concepts. But um, I would say, if I want to base it off like the apps that that I built professionally into things like that is um, look for an application that has a login experience on there where someone has to log in, have some type of form for them to fill out, and then you're now using an API and you're using a database to either retrieve information or send information to, or basically to get or post. Um, Having accessibility is another big thing too. Being able to make sure that you're following all the right procedures and policies for accessibility. And it's something that's so challenging that I'm constantly focusing on, is how to make sure my content is readable, make sure that my images are not blurry, make sure that when the tab order goes for someone who is using the keyboard, that actually goes in the appropriate user flow that it needs to go. Um, I built a notepad application in React, and it has a login and database. It's basically a CRUD application, so it allows me to they want to create a note, it allows them to edit a note, it allows them to just read it, it allows them to delete it if they want to, and then I have an archive where they can see a list of the notes that they currently have. So that's a really good way to kind of get the whole experience of building that application. And then I would say just look at a good thing that, okay, I can't, for one thing that I was doing or I'll do is I'll take um, old applications and I'll try to update them using the hooks. So I'll basically refactor a class component into using a hook, and then I'll try to take a functional component and refactor it back into a class, and seeing if I'm able to do it. So those are things I practice on doing. But yeah, I would say any kind of CRUD application that allows you to go to a database, allows you to have a login, error messages in case they're not able to log in. So if you take a good example of looking at, um, let me see here. If we look at a good example would be, let's see here. So we can, if I share my screen, do I have to stop sharing the slide to share my screen or no?
I think you
Um,
just shared the window and not,
okay,
or yeah, the window, not the
okay,
screen.
perfect. All
So
right, perfect.
I'm gonna
Awesome.
remove that one there. You can
All right. Browser would
add
like to
a new one and I'll
record.
throw it in there for you.
Okay. So the reason, Charles, I was going to say to look at I've got to go and add permissions for it, so I'm not going to do that right now. But there is, if you go to my website and kind of look through there, there's a lot of accessibility things I added to it. I don't have a database attached to it. I kind of just use a constant file that houses a bunch of my data. just because I wanted my website to be built with just vanilla JavaScript and kind of going through that process. But that's what I would recommend is login is really important. So being able to create a form, having it APIs, being able to either get or post or what they call patch or update, being able to also delete that information, uh, and then just kind of exploring those use hooks, since that's the direction that everything is going. I'm seeing that used so much more often now is hooks versus class components and versus using like Redux and MobX and things like that. But I can't hear you, Zach.
Oh gosh, I'm so bad at that.
It's all right.
So that's what I was saying. It's really cliche, the To Do app, but it really does encompass a lot of like
Mm-hmm.
good stuff that you need. Like I did the same thing recently, just because I wanted to build a API and back end with C sharp, and because I've been working with Angular at work, I'm just going to use Angular and get more practice with it, right? But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Coriano, I cannot thank you enough for your time and your effort, and making the slides and all that kind of stuff is it's great. Really glad to have you on, and super thankful for the knowledge.
Oh, you're welcome. And just so everybody know, if you want a copy of the slides, just let me know, and I can get that. Austin, anyone here, if you do want a copy, just reach out. Like I said, you can reach out to me through my website, or you can go if you're part of Co-Connector. Love to hear from you on there too as well. And yeah, then maybe we can get together and work on some React applications together in the future. That'd be great.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Coriano, and everybody else for joining in. We really appreciate you hanging out and taking the time out of your night to hang out with us, serve questions, and all of that stuff. Again, this is Northwest Arkansas Coders guest speaker slot. We're really happy to have had Coriano on. We've got projects going on within our uh, within our Discord group. Sorry, I forgot the name of Discord for a second there. And we're always trying to help people in any way that we can along their journey into development, uh, and life for that matter. We talk about a bunch of random stuff. So, anyways, we're super thankful, and I hope you all have a great night. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you guys. Thanks for having me, Zach.
Thank you.